Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the monthly webinar series, Talking Tactics. This webinar series is made available by GSS, Government Sourcing Solutions, and NJPA, the National Joint Powers Alliance. I am your host, Tom Morgan, NJPA Contract Administrator, and today's topic will be cooperative purchasing laws and practices for two states, Florida and Ohio. Our expert presenters today are Jane Benton and Mike Smith, both of whom were previously state chief procurement officers. A couple housekeeping items. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will use the chat feature to conduct that Q&A. And we will now open the floor to Jane Benton, who will cover the state of Florida. And again, welcome everyone, and we look forward to a great session today.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Talking Tactics today. Mike and I are looking very forward to talking a little bit about Florida and Ohio. Some of you know, and probably a lot of you do, that I was the previous Arkansas State Director, and actually now run the GSS headquarters here in Central Florida. So I'm actually in Florida today, where it's a beautiful sunny day outside. Let's start talking a little bit about the state of Florida, and it is the fourth largest state in the United States today based on population. Now, we laugh at the little over 20 million population, which we do have a very large population, but as most of you can probably guess, that population at the certainly highest amount is in the winter months when our snowbirds come to visit us. They are starting to come back in as we speak. The other night when I flew into Orlando, there were quite a few on the bus that I ride coming back home. So we are starting to see the influx of that. During the summer months and the more hot months, we see less population, about 20 to 25%. So we would have 15 to 16 million located in Florida during that time period. But people are bringing their kids to Disney, and so there's always a lot of people in and out of Florida because of Disney and also the beaches, wonderful beaches that we have here. There are not as many counties as you would probably expect, being the size of Florida and the landmass that we have, but there are some major metropolitan areas that most people are very familiar with. I'm going to actually start with South Florida and work back up. South Florida, of course, has the Keys, Miami, all the way up to Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach. This is a huge metropolitan area, and a lot of you are probably already doing business there. Then on the other side, on the west side of Florida, you'll have the Tampa area, which goes all the way down into Naples. That's a little over 100-mile stretch through there in that metro area, and there's a lot of things going on at that on the west side as well. Then you've got Orlando Metro and what they call the Space Coast, and that's over in Melbourne, Titusville, coming up toward Daytona. Then Jacksonville, up in that area, that's the very northern part of our state, up close to Georgia. Now, it's a little unusual in that our capital in Tallahassee, over where you see the star, over in the Panhandle, is not as populated. It's a little less than 200,000 people, and it's just not one of the key areas. It's a little inland, but there's always a lot of things going on in Tallahassee because they have several colleges there, and also they have the state capitol and a lot of business and governance going on from there. We do have a good amount of public universities. I'm sure y'all are very familiar with some of our larger ones, but they also have a large infrastructure for community colleges as well. All of the universities and community colleges have a very high population of students typically. Our budget is a little over $80 million in an annual period. Our current governor, Rick Scott, is a Republican. He is best known most recently, for the work that he did with Hurricane Irma. And he was very aggressive and very upfront. As soon as we suspected that Irma was going to hit the state of Florida, he really is out on the street, asking people to leave, and very engaged. He's a very engaged and governor that goes out and meets with the people. He is probably wealthy in his own right and knows a lot of wealthy people, and there are a lot of wealthy people in Florida, as you can imagine. He is very connected, but he's also very down to earth. People typically really like Governor Scott. But he is in the last term, as he's going to term limit out at the end of 2018. His big focus has been on the increasing jobs in Florida and has been very successful doing that, again, because of his collaboration efforts and people generally liking how he works. You'll see that the legislature in Florida is very Republican. And so those have, between the governor and the legislature being dominated by the Republicans, they have been very successful in getting some things done, but that does not mean that they always agree. They typically do not start their session until March of every year. It's a little later than most. But next year, because it's an election year, they will start in January, and that typically runs for 60 days. Certainly some of the things in our environment in Florida are, like every other state, we're seeing increased control. People want, the legislature and other governing bodies, even locally, really wanting to have more input and control over where money is spent and how it's spent. The budgets are tight, but there's money in Florida. And then there are some preferences here that some states have, but Florida has quite a few preferences. You can read those. Under the others, I didn't list those. They're probably not as typically used by you with NJPA contracts, such as things, commodities that are either produced or manufactured or grown in Florida. That would be one preference. However, that could be applicable to you. And also, there is a preference for businesses with a drug-free workplace. My Florida marketplace is it's been around for quite a few years. It is a very seasoned and in-depth e-procurement platform, one of the first in the nation, and they have spent a lot of time and money working through that. Let's look a little bit at some of the authority that the Department of Management Services, but particularly the Procurement Division has in Florida. They have authority over, of course, all policies and regulations dealing with state agencies, but they particularly have developed guidelines not only for the state agencies, but also looking at trying to help others to do the right thing. They're always a resource for cities, counties, school districts, and higher education, even though those are under separate regulations. Now, when a state contract is created by the Department of Management Services and Procurement, state agencies have to purchase from those. So they are the Procurement Division is very good about analytics of looking at what have the agencies been purchasing, how are they purchasing it, and, do we really need a contract? Because they don't want to create a contract or adopt a use of a contract that's not going to be widely used. Florida actually is very good at those analytics, and they have developed major key indicators that they want to look at to ensure that they are getting those types of contracts. Higher education is separate from the state agencies. They can purchase from the state contracts. They do not have to. They have autonomy from the Procurement Division. Political subdivisions, certainly those that I consider cities, counties, and school districts, are going to have separate laws, which are typically seen in other states as well. But they have to certainly follow the rules that are in place that was created by the State Board of Education. An interesting bill that I thought you would be interested in seeing is the one that started in 2016. And this actually started that July, and it said that before, even though the higher ed units and schools do not have to purchase, they're not mandated to purchase from those contracts in Florida, they do have to check to see and look at them to see, is that contract something that the entity would be able to use? If not, they have to determine why, and they have to document that in the file. Because this is still relatively new, it has not gone through a really good audit cycle, I think this will be interesting to see how much the K-12 and higher ed are actually documenting this for them. But it does give more visibility to the contracts that state procurement is developing. Roz Ingram, her name is Rosalind Ingram, she goes by Roz, actually came from the Department of Corrections, Florida Department of Corrections. She is the current chief procurement official. She is very savvy. She, particularly coming from a large agency in Florida, she is very well respected and certainly sees things from a very granular level sometimes. However, because her department is large and the state of Florida is so large, she typically delegates a lot of this to her top management level. They have a really good staff based on everything I have seen. Roz is very dynamic and expects to get the very best pricing being as large a state as Florida is. In fact, Roz is very proud of some of the contracts she has negotiated, because she has negotiated some very good terms and very good pricing for the state of Florida. And Florida is a very large purchaser. We'll see these statistics on that in a minute. But there are laws, of course, that Roz and her team uphold from the state legislature. Some of the thresholds that we always find interesting for state agencies and what they have to deal with is being able to show you what those are. From $0 to $2,500, we call it open market. State agencies are able to go out and make their own purchases. But between $2,500 and $35,000, they have to file and process a quote and you'll see here when it says MFMP, that is for My Florida Marketplace, and that is a common term that you will see throughout the state procurement website. They have to place that e-quote system in there to see, what kind of pricing they will get. So again, very conscious about pricing in the state of Florida. Then over $35,000, they must do a formal solicitation. Roz's staff, the state procurement staff, have authority over goods and services. This would include IT services, but they also have to work in conjunction with the state CIO, Chief Information Officer, and his team to make sure that they are purchasing what's needed. And as we all know, the complexity of IT purchases today is hard and very difficult, particularly for procurement staff that may or may not be as technologically savvy. So they work very close with the CIO to make sure that they are bidding correctly. Department of Transportation does not fall under the CPO, nor does construction, although construction does fall under the Department of Management Services, just like the CIO does. Also, surplus property, some of y'all are interested in surplus property. They fall under Department of Management Services, but not procurement. So the CPO, Roz Ingram, has authority over goods and services throughout the state of Florida in those contracts. Florida is a very open state for the use of cooperatives. They do use NJPA a lot, but they purchase off of many, and they have also purchased from other state contracts. So they do look at what is needed and make sure that it is a contract that's going to be used. You will hear them at state procurement and throughout the state talk about the adoption of cooperative contracts. They actually call them, once they are adopted by the state, they are called alternative contract source. So that should alert you anytime you see that term that they have actually adopted a cooperative contract or one piggybacked off another state. They have not been fed specifically by the state. But they are open to that when they see a need for that. One of the best ways that you can start working in Florida and try to promote an NJPA contract is I highly recommend starting at the agency level. State procurement is not interested typically in looking at that if a state agency has not requested it. So whatever you're selling, you need to make sure that there is a need at a state agency, and I'll talk in a few minutes about a form that that agency actually has to fill out and send over to state procurement. So it's very vital that you talk to state procurement, but also they're going to want to know when you meet with them what is the interest out there in one of our agencies. Who are they? How much they anticipate spending? So know some details going into state procurement with that. While we are not having major budget issues here in Florida, they did have to have a special session and as I mentioned earlier, that Governor Scott and the legislature, even though they're both Republican-led, are not always in agreement. So getting that budget this year had to require a special session. Several of the things that are really important in Florida are certainly, if you think back on Governor Scott's big desire to increase jobs and increase the economics in Florida, he is very much promoting tourism, as Florida is best known for, but he looks extensively at things that are going to help create jobs outside the tourist industry, because while that's certainly a large driver in Florida, there's got to be other things to help support that. Therefore, he's looking at, he and his administrators are looking for local spend, and that's why you'll see some of those preferences involved in that. He's looking for minority and women-owned businesses and looking most to see how can we grow those jobs in Florida. Here's some of the statistics I wanted to share with you that if you'll see there are quite a few NJPA members in Florida. There are a little over 100 contracts being used in Florida, but you'll see too that there is a large amount being spent on these contracts. So $320 million is being spent on the contract in the last couple of years. But based on that $84 billion budget, there is certainly still plenty of opportunity in Florida, and because they are receptive to cooperatives, still a lot of opportunities here in the state of Florida to promote your NJPA contract. What I find out there when I'm meeting with schools and local, other locals, counties and cities in Florida, is that they do use state contracts. They do use cooperative contracts. They want to make sure they're in compliance. It's certainly one of the bigger things. There are a lot of very large school districts and cities in Florida, whereas, my home state of Arkansas, you did not have that as much. In fact, I always get tickled. There are some cities and school districts in Florida that actually their budget is larger than the whole state of Arkansas. So there is a lot of opportunity with large districts and a lot of medium size too, and smaller ones, of course. So there are a lot of business opportunities in Florida with cooperative contracts. I'd mentioned earlier the My Florida Marketplace. If you're not registered on that, you can go register for free. And once you're in that My Florida Marketplace, there's a lot of information that you can see. I mean, there's so much that they have built into that for a couple of reasons. One, they really want to be transparent. We call them sunshine laws here. No pun intended, I'm sure. but they want everyone to see what's going on out there in the government, and they want to make sure that they have given access to all of you suppliers to be able to look at that. And the buyers and the sellers are in and out of that marketplace all the time. So if you're not registered, you must go get registered. That is just one place that you can sign up. You will receive, bid notifications for based on your commodity codes that you sign up for. So I highly encourage you to go do that. It has been a really good place for particularly small businesses trying to expand into Florida or inside of Florida. So it's just a really good e-procurement platform to get in and get registered so you can start seeing some of the things that are going on in Florida all the time. Here are some of the unique things that Florida has. I mentioned earlier, they do have in-state preferences. If you're a Florida business, you have a 5% in-place. I'm sorry, I hit something and didn't mean to. Okay, somebody else did. Okay, we got it. There are, you have to be a lawful permanent resident here in Florida to have that business located here. There are rules and regulations. I have that resource for you. So they do get a 5% preference. So no going in, even with a cooperative, they are looking at that 5% preference. Local levels can enact actually more than the state level can. If they are wanting to have a larger amount of their business going to minority businesses, they can put that in their local municipal regulations. Here's some more information I mentioned earlier about the alternate contract source. This is taken actually off of the Florida procurement website. It just says that agency director. So if you were with, if you went to like Department of Corrections or Florida State Police, and that director is going to have to sign off on a form that is on the page on the procurement website saying why they want to use it, all the details surrounding that. Then when that gets to state procurement, that buyer that is assigned to that will look at that extensively, and then Roz Ingram has to sign that form or her designee for them to be able to use this. So if you're wanting to market to a state agency, just keep in mind, and that contract's not already in place, you'll have to, that agency, once you build that desire for them to purchase from you, will have to go through Roz's shop. Okay, I don't have control anymore, guys. Tom, can you forward that? There you go. Thank you. These are the resources that I provided for you to take a look at, just to make it easy for you. I know you'll have a copy of this. The first one is the State Procurement Office website, and I could not get the link on that. You'll have to look under forms, but there actually is a form for that alternate source contract under that form number. Also, a lot of you are in construction and want to look at that. There's a link for that, Department of Transportation. There is a lot of information on the Transparency website in Florida. I encourage you to take a few minutes, which, it's just like Facebook, it'll pull you in there and you'll be in there for hours. But being able to look at that and start looking, you can often tell how much an agency, a specific agency, or across-the-board agencies have purchased what you are selling. And I think that's really great information to know. Or maybe no one is selling that currently, and you do need to go get that adopted as an alternate source contract. And of course, in the statutes, then that really will put you to sleep if you need light reading. However, they are easy to query in the statutes, and you can actually link off of those as well from the state procurement website. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have at the end of this presentation. Regarding the state of Florida, it is a very large market that I hope all of you are looking to try to penetrate with your NJPA contract, and look forward to answering any questions. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mike Smith, my colleague in the Midwest. Mike?
Thanks, Jane. Great job talking about Florida. And unlike Jane, I am not living in the state that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the state of Ohio for a little bit. A little bit of background on myself. Like Jane, I was former over procurement for the state of Illinois. I worked for Illinois for about 23 plus years and still live in the Springfield, Illinois area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ohio here, and also known as the Buckeye State, as most of you know that are familiar, and home of the bad luck Cleveland Indians for you baseball fans. Cleveland won almost every game in the month of September leading up to the playoffs, and then won the first 2 games of the playoffs, and then somehow lost 3 straight to the New York Yankees. So congratulate Yankee fans, but not a happy day in Cleveland today. Like Florida, Ohio is one of the larger states in the country. It's 7th in overall population, and you can see here between the cities and villages and counties and higher educational institutions and school districts, there's plenty of opportunity to market cooperative purchasing and NJPA contracts. Some of the key areas, Columbus, the capital, which is actually a larger city than most people think it is. It's 15th or 16th largest city in the country. Cleveland metro area, Cincinnati area, which if you're familiar with Ohio, are all on the same highway, Interstate 71. And a couple other larger areas in the state. Around the Toledo area, there's a lot of governments. Around the Dayton area, there's a number of larger governments that you could visit and talk about NJPA contract. And if people that live in central Ohio would say that a key area is the campus of the Ohio State University. The governor of the state of Ohio is John Kasich. He's in the middle of his 2nd term, so he's been there long enough now to have impacted procurement and procurement policies and the way procurement operates. And one of these directives, executive directives that he's issued, I will talk about a little bit later in this presentation. The legislature in Ohio is only one of 7 or 8 states that meets year-round, and like Florida, it's an overwhelmingly Republican-led state. Both the legislature and the governor are Republican Party, so everyone who has elected officials, most elected officials in Ohio come from that party, which again, it can be good and bad. Also a little bit different in Ohio is the budget. They operate on a 2-year cycle. So their current budget, it says $133 billion. That's for a period of 2 years, which is fiscal year 18, and then again next year in fiscal year 19. But just because they have a 2-year budget doesn't mean they can spend all their money this year and not have any going into next year. There's still some demarcations of how much money can be spent during each fiscal year. Some statistics, NJPA statistics from Ohio. There have been some success there. Over 2,800 members, NJPA members in Ohio. And I looked at this figure and said, well, wait a minute, there's only so many school districts and cities and towns, and they only add up to 1,600 or 1,700. How could there be 2,800 NJPA members? And making the assumption that that means there's multiple members within various organizations and other organizations that may not be considered a city or a county or school or state entity. So what this tells you is that the state of Ohio and their local jurisdictions are very open to using NJPA contracts. Over 100 or 140 contracts used, $250 million in the last 3 years. And like Jane said in Florida, that's just, it's a big number, but there's a huge opportunity. Each year, just the state of Ohio itself spends $6 billion on supplies and services. So there's still plenty of opportunity to grow the numbers presented on this page. We've discussed on other talking tactic presentations, it's always important to understand the organizational structure of a state in order to be successful in promoting your contract to them. What are the key agencies? What authority does central procurement have in terms of contracting? What other agencies, divisions, or sections have autonomy when it comes to establishing contracts and when it comes to looking at NJPA contracts? In other words, depending on the product or service you sell, where's the best place to market your contract? Ohio does have one procurement code, but there are a number of agencies and divisions and even sections that have designated authority to drive many of their own procurement decisions that the code allows for. The Central Procurement Office, or Procurement Services as it's noted here, is under the Department of Administrative Services, or DAS. Like many states, DAS acts as the administrative agency for most of the statewide support functions, including procurement. And DAS has several divisions, 4 of which I've listed here. One's in blue, under General Services, that including the Procurement Services section I mentioned earlier. The Procurement Services section is the home of the Chief Procurement Officer, Kelly Sanders. And again, similar to what Jane talked about in Florida, Kelly's background is from the Department of Corrections, where she worked for many years. So she has a corrections background. She's been the CPO about 2 years now. Most of your NJPA contracts would either touch or in some way filter through the CPO's office, through Kelly's office. It is the key procurement contact for the state. However, it's important to note that the other sections that are listed here under General Services, fleet and facilities, printing, the mail services, surplus property, they all have some autonomy to do their own contracting and to make their own decisions. Now, again, procurement might or might not be involved, but those entities do establish some of their own contracts and would be involved in building the business case. So if you have a contract related to mail or facilities or fleet or surplus, it's best to start in those locations and to work your way to procurement rather than the other way around. The other divisions listed here on the right, the Equal Opportunity Office of Information Technology and Human Resources you probably wouldn't deal with much, but Equal Opportunity is the home of the MBE program, the EDGE program, and the Veterans Enterprise program, which I will touch on a little bit later because it has become a key element in contracting in Ohio. The Office of Information Technology, for the last couple of years anyway, have managed their own contracts and have established their own contracts and have processed their own procurement transactions. Again, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but that's changing as well. A couple other key agencies you should be aware of. The Ohio Department of Transportation does have some autonomy in the state. And it's not only for the federal area, like the highway construction we always think about, but also for general procurements. They have their own financial system. There was an attempt this year to try to merge their financial system with the one at DAS. I don't think that worked. Maybe wrong, but I don't think it worked. So they have a separate system. They also maintain their own website where they publish their own bids, maintain their own contracts. And, all that said, though, DOT will use some state contracts established by DAS as well. But they do operate somewhat independently from the rest of the state. The Ohio Facilities Construction Commission, I put that on here. It's a new agency. It probably wouldn't apply to a lot of NJPA contract holders, but it is an agency that is the construction arm of the state. And they will handle anything to do with usually larger construction projects. However, the reason I included it here is there's some debate right now around the definition of construction and the definition of maintenance. DAS would handle most things that would be considered anything considered maintenance, whereas the OFCC would handle anything construction. So they're trying to define those two terms, and if it's defined where maintenance includes more than it is today, some NJPA contract holders may find themselves working with the OFCC as opposed to DAS. So what about the local jurisdictions in Ohio? What's their authority in terms of cooperative purchasing, in terms of contracting in general? How are they connected to the state from a procurement perspective? Well, in general, local governments, K through 12 schools, universities, have full autonomy in regard to procurement. Most have the authority to use cooperative purchasing on their own. You need to obviously check with each one individually because their authorities and ordinances do vary a little bit. For example, the city of Columbus, the largest city and the capital city in Ohio, can use cooperative contracts and can use NJPA contracts, but it has to be approved by the city council. And the CPO there has to put together a very sound business case to do that. And it's proven to be very challenging to get a cooperative contract through that city council. They tend to want to do their own thing. City of Cleveland, same thing. Cleveland City Council is all about using local providers. So getting a cooperative contract approved, again, while the authority is there, can be difficult. But still, as mentioned earlier, there's many local governments and schools out there, and most do not have this same type of scrutiny. I also wanted to mention here how locals use state of Ohio contracts, because it can be a little confusing when you look at the website, the state's website. If the state adopts your NJPA contract, you'll want to make sure that they add it to what they call cooperative purchasing, their cooperative purchasing program. Locals and schools can use state contracts by enrolling in this cooperative purchasing program and by paying a small fee. So if you get an opportunity to get a state contract, you want to make sure that it's made available to through this cooperative purchasing program. I don't think it's an automatic. I think the state makes that decision for each contract they put in place. Also, I wanted to mention DOT, as I said, has some autonomy. They have their own cooperative purchasing program that is similar to the one at DAS, but if you're going to work with DOT, you might want to look into that as well. Might open some doors within the local government departments of transportation and public works departments. All right, DAS procurement methodology. So how does the Central Procurement Authority establish contracts? What are some various ways? Well, the obvious ways are through a solicitation, the invitation to bid or an RFP. They also can use reverse auctions, although I don't think they do that very often anymore. And there's something called state term schedules and master maintenance agreements. Both of these are basically non-bid negotiated contracts. They're often based on GSA pricing or based on some type of proposal offered by the supplier. They're similar to what a GSA schedule would be. It's more of an application process. And some of you might have state term schedules with your NJPA contracts. I know they would sometimes adopt a cooperative contract and put it under a state term schedule. And there's been some change. If you're one of those, you already know what I'm going to say later, but there's been some changes in the state term schedule process I'm going to cover in a few minutes. Small purchase, I call it small purchase. I don't know if the state calls it that, but agencies in Ohio do have the ability to spend up to $50,000 with each vendor for each year without going to bid. So if there's no statewide master contract that exists for your product or service, and an agency wants to purchase something off your NJPA contract, they have the authority to do so up to $50,000. Now that said, I'm sure there's some other rules and policies and processes they need to follow, but that opportunity does exist. And then finally, cooperative purchasing contract, not internal cooperative to them, but actually an NJPA or another type of cooperative, is also a methodology that the state does utilize and has utilized over the years to get contracts in place. So, and what they do is they'll look at cooperative purchasing, like an NJPA contract, as another tool. So when they're developing their strategy to establish a contract, they'll look at a cooperative purchasing contract, weigh its value, and if they can demonstrate the greatest value, it is strongly considered as their methodology to get that contract in place. On the NJPA website, you probably, if you've looked at Ohio at all, you've seen NJPA has listed the authority that Ohio governments in general have to use cooperative purchasing contracts. What I've included here is a different statute. This is actually the Department of Administrative Services specific authority to participate in and adopt cooperative purchasing contracts, not only for their use, but for use by political subdivisions in the state as well. So this gives that agency direct authority to enter into agreements with purchasing consortia and others. Note on here, too, that near the bottom, the Department of Transportation is listed separately, which again leads to that autonomy in contracting. All right, I mentioned earlier that the responsibility of the Minority Business Enterprise Program falls under an equal opportunity division, and that there's some differences here maybe in other states, and that's what I want to cover for a minute. I said earlier that the governor had impacted procurement during his tenure, the last 6 years he's been in office. And, for years, I've worked with Ohio for years, and they would strategically source goods and services, and if a cooperative purchasing contract proved to be the best value, they'd adopt that contract and move forward. If the price, the service, the delivery, et cetera, was the best, they would have no trouble adopting that contract. Well, about 3 or so years ago, the governor's office, the current governor, decided to place a greater emphasis on growing MBE and what they call EDGE program, Encourage Diversity, Growth, and Equity, which is basically a small business program. And to do this, he directed procurement to find ways to not only meet the 15% set-aside goal, but to enhance opportunities for those suppliers that meet those requirements. And this directive has had a major impact on how procurement approaches each individual contracting opportunity, and it's had an impact on their use of cooperative purchasing contracts. Most of you know that MBE programs or MWBE programs exist in many states, and most will count subcontracting dollars towards their goal. So if you have a contract with that state and you subcontract out 10% of the work to a certified minority vendor, then that state can count that subcontracting goal. In Ohio, that doesn't work that way. The way it works in Ohio is the only way an Ohio state agency can count dollars spent towards the 15% goal is if that minority business enterprise won the contract through a competitive solicitation. Now, that's different than most states. So even, unless you're a certified minority business enterprise in Ohio, if you hold an NJPA contract, there's no way the state can adopt that contract, no matter any way, shape, or form, towards their goal. Even if you subcontract, even if you assign it to somebody else, they can't do it. The only way they count it is if the minority business wins the bid through a competitive solicitation. So I wanted to put that out there because that has an impact on their decision process on whether to use a cooperative contract. You may go to them and say, here, my contract is the best. You can beat every price, the delivery service, perfect. Your other contract's expiring. And they may say, well, that's all great, but we're going to set this one aside for minority vendor participation. And it goes back to this focus of the administration is why they're doing it. On the right there, you see a photo of what is a publication, and this is online. There's a website at the end that you can find it on, but it's the projections and plans for 2018 of the Equal Opportunity Division, specifically related to minority business enterprise. And this publication actually lists the various categories that they're going to target for 2018 to reach the 15% goal. So what's new in Ohio procurement? Mentioned a few things here. E-procurement, which we've talked about on these presentations in the past and talked about them in different NJPA presentations, is something that continues to be a growing trend in the public sector. Ohio has been working on an RFP for a new, very robust e-procurement system for a long time now. It was released just a couple of weeks ago. So probably by the end of the year, I forgot the exact due date, but Ohio will expect to receive offers from e-procurement vendors towards this new system. And throughout 2018, they'll probably be doing a lot of evaluation. What does this mean for NJPA suppliers? Well, depending on what the system looks like, and they're actually, wanting the suppliers to be very creative and innovative and given that what's the next generation of e-procurement look like, it may have an impact on how suppliers do business with the state of Ohio. They're going to have the new system is intended to have greater insight into their spend and be able to manage their contracts better. So if I was a supplier, I would just kind of keep my eye on this to see where it goes. I mentioned earlier the veteran enterprise, and the number of states are starting to implement veteran business enterprise preferences or set-asides. In Ohio, it's fairly new, and what they're really doing is, as they're making decisions to contract with vendors, if it's a veteran, what they call veteran-friendly business, which I think it means you actually don't have to be owned, but you might hire a lot of veterans, that you might be given some extra bonus points. So if you happen to have a business that's veteran-owned, or you have a lot of veterans or meet some requirements of this, it might help you in promoting your NJPA contract there. Mentioned state term schedules earlier. Again, if some of you may have some of these with your NJPA contract, it was more of an application process than an actual bid to get on a state term schedule, and agencies could use it if it was in their best interest. Well, new policy this past summer, it changed that a little bit. What they are now doing, Ohio is saying if there is a contract on their state term schedule and an agency wants to use it, they can, but they still got to go get 3 separate quotes. So even if there's a contract out there, they're going to have to prove that contract is the best by getting 3 separate quotes. If they don't get it, they have to get a waiver from what's called the controlling board, which is a legislative agency, and get approval to go outside of the policy. So what this is leading to is that state term schedules really aren't going to mean a whole lot in Ohio, and eventually I'm sure they'll fade away, maybe not totally, but to the point where they're not used by agencies. And finally, IT procurement. I said earlier that the Office of Information Technology was responsible for processing procurement transactions, for conducting bids on their own, and for establishing their own contracts. Either, I don't know exactly when, but either this week or next week, that responsibility is going to transition over to the CPO's office. So the Office of Information Technology still exists as a separate entity and being led by the CIO of the state, but the procurement and the establishment of contracts and a lot of the decisions to how IT will get their products and services will now be under the CPO. So if you have a contract that is related to IT and you've been working with the IT department, you still might be doing that, but in the end, that going forward, they're going to be the end user and not the entity who establishes the contract. So you might be working with 2 different divisions there. And then finally, as Jane provided, I got a couple, just a page of resources here. Department of Administrative Services, DAS, provided a website there. The top one is general information. You can find the contact information, Ohio processes, laws, rules, etc. You can find the MBE publication that I mentioned earlier that might contain some categories of what's going to be set aside this coming year. The second link there goes directly to the current contracts page. If I was looking to contract with the state of Ohio, I'd want to know who has the contract for my product or service today, when does it expire, are the renewals available, and any other terms and conditions that go with it, so I can compare what I have to that and know when I need to reach out to the state. Also include a link to the Ohio Department of Transportation. This link will take you to the page that has everything about procurement at ODOT, including their current solicitations and current listing of contracts. And then finally, for K through 12, Ohio counties, large Ohio cities, university system in Ohio. I didn't put any links here other than right back to the NJPA website, where it gives you the legal authority for all of these entities to use NJPA contracts. And I'd encourage you to take advantage of all the resources provided by NJPA to help market your contract to state of Ohio and its political subdivisions. And that's all I have on Ohio.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Jane. Great job. Thanks for the great information on both Florida and Ohio. It is now time for Q&A, and we already have 2 questions, so I'll start with the first one. The state of Arkansas is considering canceling our state contract because of low usage, but our category is very cyclical, and we did over $1 million in 2016, but only $100,000 in 2017. Do you have any advice? I don't know who wants to take that, Mike or Jane?
This is Jane. I'd probably be the best one to take that. My first suggestion would be to try to get a meeting with the Deputy Director, Randy Wright, who is there at the State Procurement Office. I believe he is the primary one that looks at those contracts. If you have a specific buyer that you have been working with that has experience with this contract, you may want to talk to them first to see if they will join you in that meeting and explaining to Mr. Wright how cyclical the business is and that who is using it. I think sometimes for them to be able to see exactly who's using it is helpful.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can we get a copy of this presentation? Otherwise, will they be recorded and posted to NJPA's website? They will be. This is being recorded, and they are posted on the NJPA Access for Vendor page, top right-hand corner of our website, Access for Vendors, and then Vendor Resources. So it'll take us some time to edit and cut it down, but it will be posted. Please feel free to have questions keep coming in. We have about 8 minutes left till the top of the hour, and we're happy to answer any questions either now or in the future for anyone on the call. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I would also like to put a plug in for the next Talking Tactics webinar, November 9th. Ask the Procurement Professional. Nicole and Mark will be our expert presenters next month, so we look forward to that. Be on the lookout in your inbox for that invite and information on the WebEx call-in number and everything that you use to get on today's call. Again, we will keep it open for a few more minutes here in case any other questions come in.
Hey, Tom, this is Mike. I think we're going to make a change to that next Talkin' Tactics.
Okay.
It's going to be still the state of Maryland, but instead of Mark doing Massachusetts, I'm going to do the state of Michigan.
Gotcha. Thanks for that correction. We'll be sure to note that when we create the invite here in the next week or so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question did come in. Why is the Florida Sheriff's, I assume the Florida Sheriff's contract, so popular in the state of Florida?
I'm not sure, but I'll be glad to research that a little bit for you. I have noticed that there are certain counties in Florida that have very strong contracts that people piggyback off of a lot from the other counties, cities, and school districts. I have not heard that about the Sheriff's Department Association. I'm assuming it would be more for law enforcement type supplies or equipment, and that may be the case with that. But I'll research that a little bit.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't know any more about that.
That's okay. We do hear quite a bit about it from our both members and vendors in the state of Florida, the Florida Sheriff's contracts. Personally, I'm not overly familiar with what type of contracts, but I would assume, like you, Jane, that they're more sheriff, police specific. But I don't.
And that's my guess too. They probably have gone out, and because of the size of Florida, they do have leverage, and they go out and work on those, and have obviously been marketing those contracts to other sheriff's departments, and have seen some adoption. But yeah, I'd like to research that a little bit and get back with you.
Yes. We do have another question, and maybe I'll answer the first part. You state that Florida contracts are mandatory, although many state agencies are on NJPA's membership list, including the state of Florida. Define mandatory. And if I could just for a second, before Jane jumps in, various contracts of NJPA's have been adopted in the past by the state of Florida. So we believe that's where much of the usage from state agencies is coming from, are from those contracts that NJPA did the solicitation on, did the evaluation, eventually awarded the contracts to XYZ vendor, and then Florida came to us and adopted those contracts, which then obviously became fair game for other state agencies to use. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Jane.
Sure, I'll be glad to do that. Like a lot of other state procurement offices, the contracts that they solicit and award, those are the ones that I would call them Florida state contracts, statewide contracts. Those are the ones the state agencies have to use. The NJPA type contract, any type cooperative contract is under that category that I mentioned, alternate source contracts is what they call them here in Florida. So those are not mandatory, but the ones that state procurement bids and awards are. And they're typically not going to be conflicting. So I would not award a contract for a particular commodity, for example, at state procurement, and then adopt a cooperative that would compete with it.
Right, right. Thanks for that. Mike, maybe this one's for you since it's Ohio. If the agency is an NJPA member, is the adoption by DAS of an NJPA contract necessary?
Well, the agency could request that DAS approve the NJPA contract. If I'm in that situation and it's a specific agency contract and I'm an NJPA supplier, I would help that agency build the business case then to present to DAS. But ultimately, yes, DAS would have to approve that unless it's DOT. That agency would need DAS's approval to move forward.
For state agencies?
Yeah, well, DAS, because individual agencies, like in any state, you know, if they have a unique need that only applies to them, they can usually are given some authority to do their own contract, where
right.
They'll go to DAS and DAS will say, that's just for your agency. You know, we grant delegated authority for you to go out and do what you need to do. So I think the same thing would apply here. DAS would grant that authority to that agency. Now, if that agency wanted to use an NJPA contract and went to DAS and DAS said, you know, about 10 other agencies use this same thing, same product or service, then DAS would probably take that over and work towards a statewide contract, whether they adopted NJPA or went another route.
Gotcha. And just for clarification purposes, Mike, that might not necessarily be the case for poly-subs, political subdivisions.
Right, right. Yeah, political subdivisions, you know, do their own thing. If the question is, you know, does a local government want to use a contract, will the state of Ohio adopt it just so those locals could use it? I have not seen Ohio really go that route. I know some other states do that, like Missouri will do that, and some other states will do that. I haven't seen Ohio really go that route.
Very good. And for one last clarification point on that last question, again, if an agency is already an NJPA member, is the adoption by DAS necessary? Keep in mind, a handful of years ago, Ohio DAS did adopt NJPA contracts. State agencies were then using those contracts, and that is potentially why they are on the membership list. And if that contract is still not an active adoption, of course, you would need to present that business case to your agency so they can take it up the ladder with DAS.
Right. Right, and I think that's why I would imagine there's multiple members of NJPA that work for different state agencies.
Correct. You are accurate with that statement.
Right, and then that's okay. And if you're that agent, you are working with a specific agency, just work with them towards getting that concept and the idea of using NJPA contract up through DAS. Keep in mind though, if it's under $50,000, you know, and then they just want to buy some things and want to use the NJPA contract, an agency might be able to do that without DAS's involvement.
Well, great. We've got to the top of the hour. I don't see any further questions coming in. Special thanks to Jane and Mike. Great job. Special thank you to all of those that took the time today to jump on the webinar. And we look forward to next month. And keep on the lookout for that invite. Again, thank you, GSS. And everyone have a great rest of your week.